All right. Hello and welcome, everyone, to the Byzantine Scotist. I know it's been a while since I've done many streams. I've been quite busy recently with work, so I haven't been able to do a lot of streaming. But I wanted to talk today about something that I think is actually a very important subject that isn't discussed enough. And I think it's actually at the root of a lot of the issues we face today. People just comment in the chat, make sure you're hearing me and stuff. I want to make sure my audio is coming in. Okay. Is really, I think, a central issue we face today, which is how do we conceptualize the world around us and the whole way the world functions? And I want to contrast what I think are really two visions of the world. What I would call the hierarchical approach, which is in some sense sort of top down here. I notice on my screen, I am lagging quite a bit because I have this background here. Let me know in the thing if I'm lagging on your video. And so we have sort of this top down view of nature. And this other view, which I would call the atomist view, which is essentially a bottom up view of how the world functions. And I want to contrast these two. And I think that this really ties into everything of how we see the world here. And I think if we look at, this current crisis in the world we have, and everything is sort of fallen apart. And how is this being addressed then, let's say educationally, for example, right? So there's sort of been two approaches that Christians have had to modern science in the educational sphere. You have the sort of Protestant creationist science approach, and we have just anti-evolution science, and our whole thing is we're trying to debunk evolution. Well, first of all, we're not putting forward then our own view of the world. But I think more importantly, it's oftentimes not seriously engaging with the actual science. Oftentimes we get very bad arguments against evolution. And then they go off to college and they see, oh, these were actually really bad arguments against evolution. They've now tied that bad science they've received to the Christian faith. And so then as a result, they end up apostatizing. And that's where a lot of Catholics who are very positive towards science have a great fear. And they think the solution is that we have to fully embrace modern science sort of without question. And so this is where you get, for example, the whole theistic evolutionist approach, or I think much more so even than theistic evolution, you essentially end up with a bifurcation of your curriculum. So you teach that basically modern science describes the world of nature, and it's its own thing. It's describing the world of nature. And then over in a theology class or a philosophy class, we describe this more spiritual world, this realm of grace. But essentially, nature and grace have nothing to do with one another. So they end up being separated. Here we go. And so what ends up happening then, I think, is that this vision of the world given by sort of modern popular science, I don't think it's actually rooted in the science, but it's sort of ideological view of the world of Darwinian evolution describes all of biology. And essentially atomic theory, it describes all of physics, essentially. And then this materialist mechanistic view of the world. And this is very hard to reconcile with the sort of approach to grace that the Catholic Church takes. I wanted to first start off by looking at some scriptural readings that I actually think shed some interesting light on this question here. I know I'm rambling a bit. My notes are all in my head for this. I did not get a chance to write out actual notes, so this is going to be a quite rambly stream. Here we go. Yeah, but I was at Mass this morning in the ordinary form of the Roman Rite, and I thought the readings for this week, they actually shed some interesting light on this issue. So let me pull them up here. Here we go. And apparently when I checked the USCCB website, there's actually two different sets of possible readings for this week. These are the ones we were reading at Mass here. So our first reading was from the book of Samuel, and it was about the ordination of David to be the king of Israel. And here we have sort of our first look at a hierarchical view of the world. First of all, we see that things are run based on prophets and kings. We have these hierarchical offices here in the world. And Samuel, he's a priest, and he's been given the Holy Spirit. And then he anoints David so that David has the Spirit upon him and he can be king. So it's a sacramental hierarchical vision that we're getting here of human authority. But then we go on here, and there's this very interesting reading from the book of Ephesians here. Here we go. You were once in darkness, but now you are light in the Lord. Live as children of light, for light produces every kind of goodness and righteousness and truth. Try to learn what is pleasing to the Lord. Take no part in the fruitless works of darkness, but rather expose them, for it is shameful even to mention the things done by them in secret. But everything exposed by the light becomes visible. For everything that becomes visible is light. Therefore it says, awake, O sleeper, arise from the dead, and Christ will give you light. So we have here really an analogy of being to light going on. Right? So in the classical view, good and evil are not opposed to one another as two equal forces. Rather, they're opposed as light and darkness. When you shine a light, darkness goes away. Darkness is simply the absence of light. So we were once in darkness. We were away from God. But God is infinite being. So God is infinite light. And light produces, and notice here, every kind of goodness and righteousness and truth. So we actually have here, these aren't three random terms that St. Paul is picking. They have specific meanings. Goodness and truth are transcendental properties of being. So whatever has being has goodness and truth. And likewise, righteousness here. This is the same word in Greek for justice. This is the right ordering of things. So when God's presence or its light, it takes away darkness. It brings those things which come along with being, goodness and truth, and also orders things rightly. And then we see here a discussion of morality. So our conception of the universe and of being is closely tied to our understanding of ethics. Once we have this right view of metaphysics and of nature, it implies a certain ethic that ought to go along with it, an ethics of goodness, where goodness is not simply what we think to be good. There's not something subjective, but it's something objective in the world. Goodness is a real property of all being. All right, and then we have here in the Gospels a really interesting discussion in the Gospel here, especially when we get to the very end of it. So in the Gospel reading, there's this man who's blind, and he comes to Jesus, and Jesus heals his blindness. And he comes back then, there's this whole discussion with the Pharisees where they don't believe that he was blind and has now been healed. And then he has this discussion, Jesus has this discussion with the Pharisees here. Here we go. Then Jesus said, I came into this world for judgment, so that those who do not see might see, and those who do see might become blind. Some of the Pharisees who were with him heard this and said to him, surely we are not also blind, are we? Jesus said to them, if you were blind, you would have no sin. But now you are saying, we see, so your sin remains. There's interesting contrast going on here between physical sight and spiritual sight. And the Pharisees, they can physically see, but they're unable to see their sins. They're actually blind. And this man who is blind, he's able to see his sins, to see his need for Christ. And so he's actually, even though he's physically blind, he's the one who then is able to see. I think this really shows here a whole vision of how we understand being, how we understand the world, how we understand this hierarchical vision, where God is infinite being. He is above everything. And then he shines down light upon all things, and all things have being through God. As the Platonic language, all things have through participation. And so we're then called to ascend back up to God, to be with God. Right? And ultimately, an important part of this also is that the material world, it's not bad. The material world is good. It has being. And insofar as it has being, it has goodness. But it has a finite goodness. right? God is infinite being. And so a big part of this also is this will help us understand much more deeply why we have doctrines like divine simplicity, right? Or that God doesn't have a body. So this is sort of a big misconception now, right? Is that if we have the atomistic view, which I'll get to in a few minutes, if we have this bottom-up view of the world, that what's most real is the fundamental material realities, well, then to an atheist, God is less real because God is immaterial. And so if material things are the most real things, that if God is immaterial, he must be less real. Whereas on the other hand, our view, right, is that matter is potency. Matter is potentiality, and potentiality is less real than actuality. So the reason that God has to be immaterial is that God is too real for a body. Right? It's sort of like that example of light and the Pharisees really being blind, even though they can physically see, is that if you look directly into the sun, you're not able to see the sun. It will blind you. So God is so real. He is so bright that we who are down in this realm of matter are unable to see God, as we're so attached to the material things of this world. Now, Christianity also, in many ways, opposed the Platonic era, which we might say is the opposite, that the material world is not real at all. And then the material world, and the Gnostics held that the material world was actually evil. And the Christian view is, no, the material world is good, it's being. And insofar as anything has being, it has goodness. But it's less real, it's less good than God. And with ethics then, right, our whole ethics ultimately is to move back to God. And this comes up a lot, I think, in this season of Lent with fasting. Why do we fast? I think there's sort of two approaches oftentimes, right? Sort of the view that a lot of people have nowadays, that fasting is just so we can give some stuff up. And we sort of learn to better discipline ourselves. And that's very true. But ultimately, we should be giving up material things because upon our death, we no longer have these material things. The question is, are we going to give up everything for God? And we often ask, how could anyone freely choose hell over heaven? But we all do this every day. When we choose that material things are more important than God, when we choose not to fast and instead to just stuff our bodies with as many good things in this world as we can get, we're saying that ultimately we are not detached from those things. And if we're attached to the things of this world, then we can't attach ourselves to God. Now, the material things of this world are not bad. Ultimately, if we have this hierarchical view, this is very important that our view is not dualistic. As I've said, I'm trying to oppose dualism here as another major issue. The things of this world, ultimately, they come from God. They have being. There's only goodness. Right? Evil is simply the privation of goodness. But those material things, they are meant to cause us to ascend upwards towards God. We want to use these to ascend. Right? And if we notice there also, St. Paul, he talked about how light brings righteousness, or we might also say justice. I bet if you look this passage up actually in the Vulgate, the word there would be justitio. Actually, I'm kind of curious now. I'm going to look this up. I might disprove myself on a live stream. I'm just going to look it up in the Dewey Reams right here. Here we go. Here we go. Yep. Let me share my screen here so we can see what the Dewey Reams says here. Here. For the fruit of light is in all goodness and justice and truth. So justice is this well-ordering of things. And this is a really important point that's going to structure our whole morality and our whole understanding of political philosophy as well. So justice is the right ordering of things, right? This is why St. Paul is always talking about this idea of justification. Adam in the garden was given an original justice by God. He was given this right ordering of his soul. So his soul is ultimately ordered in right relationship to the world around him, to his neighbor, and to God, and to himself. But ultimately, this right ordering fell apart in the fall, because Adam failed to uphold justice. And the whole Old Testament, we see constantly that whoever God calls, they're unable to uphold justice. We see in Isaiah chapter 59 that God saw that there was no man that could bring justice. Even a man who can act just cannot restore the justice to the entire cosmos. And so Christ, in his infinitely perfect justice, is able to restore justice to the cosmos. And that justice is brought to us through justification, that our soul becomes now in right ordering towards God. St. Bonaventure, this is a really good book on this. It's his book, The Triple Way. You want to get it with the notes by Father Peter Damian Fellner. This Father Peter has a very good section at the beginning on this issue of hierarchization, that through especially the theological virtues of faith, hope, and charity, we're able to hierarchize our soul, to rightly order our soul, where our mental faculties of memory, intellect, and will control and regulate our appetites and our body as well, or our soul, and then our soul ultimately is rightly ordered towards God. There's a whole ethics here as well that goes along with this. And then when we often talk about justice, though, we're not talking about it in this more general sense of the right ordering of things. We often talk about it in terms of the special cardinal virtue of justice, which is what rightly orders us towards other people. There's a justice towards our neighbor. And there's also a justice towards God as well. That is the virtue of religion. And when we have this view, we see specifically and immediately why it's important that we show proper justice towards God, why we need religion. Because we are ultimately giving honor towards that which is good. And God is infinite goodness, needs that right goodness given to him. And we realize then by nature, we have to give justice to God. But we also realize by nature, if God is infinitely above us, we're unable by our own rational faculties and by abstraction to know the right way to praise God. And so then ultimately we see, well, God has to reveal to us his own inner life to show us how we ought to honor him. And that's exactly what the Catholic faith is. The Catholic faith is God descending, right? We talk about ascension and descending here. We ascend up towards God, but before we can ascend up towards God, God descends to us, and he teaches us through the church how we can ascend to him. He gives us the sacraments so that we can make that ascension. And we also see then why our whole political system ultimately needs the Catholic faith, because politics is not its own separate dualistic thing. Politics is within this realm of cosmic ordering. You want to learn more about this whole idea I'm talking about here of cosmic ordering, I want to recommend this book, Divine and Created Order, in St. Bonaventure's Theology by Father Wayne Hellman. See if I can get it to come up here. The room behind me is messy, so I'd prefer not to turn on the camera here. But hopefully you're able to see. It's called Divine and Created Order in Bonaventure's Theology. See this whole order. And so ultimately then, we have the free will to choose whether to include ourselves in this order or to oppose it. And likewise, the political authority as well can include itself or oppose it. And this is where I think our understanding of nature becomes so important. Because if you accept, maybe you might accept that everything I've said so far is true on a philosophical and spiritual level. This is true about the church, but it's ultimately not true about nature itself. That's for scientists to discover. But no, then we start dualizing things again. Then all of a sudden, our natural ethics and our natural politics are also able to be divorced from our understanding. And ultimately, grace is not its own entirely separate thing. Grace perfects nature. But if grace perfects nature, it presupposes nature as well. And so this means it doesn't tell us any particular version of nature. And neither does Scripture give us all the details we need about nature. This is the great thing about science. God created us with faculties so that we can discover nature and abstract from it. And so this is where science actually comes in as something extremely, extremely important. It's so important that Catholics be involved in engaging with science. But we have to remember that the conclusions we're getting from science, those are the things that are going to be taken up and raised up by grace. So if we get nature wrong, especially if we get it so wrong that we're getting essentially the wrong direction of it, it's not going to be properly raised up, and our whole view of grace then is going to be messed up. And ultimately then, our view of God is going to be messed up. Our view of ethics is going to be messed up. This is where I think it's so important that nature comes in. All right. So now I want to turn to this atomistic view that we often have now. Now, when I say atomism, I'm not talking about necessarily what's called atoms in modern science. So the word atom essentially means uncuttable. It was thought of by certain ancient Greek philosophers, thought that we should have this idea that we have atoms. You cut stuff up, and if you cut it down enough, you'll eventually get to the smallest things, which are called atoms. And this view is opposed by Plato and Aristotle, who are much more so taken up by the saints. And in Aristotle's view, he has what's called hylomorphism, that you have a form, right, this vertical cause, and it comes down and forms matter and makes it the singular substance. Now, we can discuss whether or not there are multiple forms in a substance. So in Bonaventure and Scotus's view, there are multiple forms in a substance, versus in Thomas's view, there's only a singular substantial form. Thomas allows other accidental forms, though, within a substance. So we can discuss and debate those, but those are all generally on the right track of what's going on here, of this hierarchical view of nature. Versus in the atomistic view, right, substances don't really exist. So I can't say, if I see a rock, right, the hylomorphic view would be, right, there's matter and there's the form of rockness. Versus in the atomistic view, essentially, if you break it down, you can cut it up into little tiny, sort of, in the classical view, like little rock things. Now, in modern science, were many people who wanted to revive this. And you could just go read their writings and see they were opposed to the schoolmen. This is not something I'm making up here. Someone online, for example, actually has put up a whole thing by Robert Boyle, who's an early chemist. And he's very clear. No, I'm trying to oppose the doctrine of the schoolmen on this point. This is not a question here. And it's very clear. And so this became sort of the basis of a lot of what was done in modern science. Now we get to the late 19th and early 20th century, when they're really starting to do serious research on what is the atom then. And they start discovering that actually the atom's not behaving like we would expect it to do. One of the famous things here is called the double slit experiment. Let me see if I can find an image that will show. Here we go. Anyway, there's a few different images, and I pull it up on Google, so I can pull up. Here it is. All right, and let's look at a few of these. This is called the double slit experiment. So basically, what they did, if you take and they would shoot photons or electrons through two slits. And so if you think these are just little tiny particles, right, they're just going to go through, and then they go through one of these two slits, and they're going to hit somewhere in the back, and you average it up, they're going to hit around the center here. That's what you would expect if these were going through like particles. But when they did the experiment, they actually found it went through like waves. So when you send waves through, waves actually interfere with one another, and you end up with what's called an interference pattern. And there's lots of good videos online about quantum physics if you want to learn more about this. All right. So now the question is, we see them going through like waves, but we also seem to have other evidence that's coming up that there are actually like particles. So maybe let's see if we can watch them go through and see which of the two slits they're going through. All right, so now we watch and we detect each photon or electron as it goes through, and it actually goes through like individual particles. Hopefully I've explained that well enough. I know it is a very confusing experiment, but it actually seems that whether we're observing the particle or not actually is affecting the way in which it goes through. It seems that the act of observing it collapses the wave function. So we have the waves. These particles are like waves. And then if we observe them, it collapses them from a wave to a singular thing. And so eventually the view that sort of came about is that there's sort of, this is an Heisenberg's interpretation of it. There's a lot of different interpretations of what's really going on there in quantum mechanics. the view that Heisenberg has is that these atoms are really not like atoms. We're not even talking about atoms now. We're talking about subatomic particles, because already they had discovered that what they had been calling atoms were actually divisible into protons, neutrons, and electrons. And they would later discover that actually the protons are divisible into up and down quarks. But really, these particles are more like waves of probability, waves of what Aristotle would call potentia, that can then be actualized by a higher force. By an efficient cause that causes them to collapse and start being only at a single point, in which case it would start again being a wave of potency. So this is actually much more like the classical view. So if we see, here we go. So the Bohr model of the atom. All right, this is what's called the Bohr model of the atom. This is probably what you will see like in sort of a high school science textbook, or you'll see in popular culture. This is what sort of people on average envision atoms to look like. And now I know the immediate objection I get to this is that any modern textbook is going to say, all right, but atoms aren't actually like this. But the fact is if we regularly visualize atoms looking like this is how it's everywhere in our culture. It doesn't matter how many little tiny captions you write that say, no, this isn't actually how it works. This is fundamentally how people are going to start visualizing the atom in their mind. All right, but you can see here what the Greeks sort of called the atoms, the indivisible. Yes, they're no longer the whole atom, but instead we sort of have these three little new indivisibles: the electron indivisible, the proton indivisible, and the neutron indivisible. All right, and so this sort of forms this idea of this. And let's see if I can find a I'm going to look for a minute, see if I can find a better model of the atom that's not a Bohr model, so I can show you sort of how things actually are. Here we go. This might be a good option to have. Here we go. All right, so the actual sort of view you get is that you can see the electrons are essentially in a wave of probability of where they are, a wave of potentiality. And this is much more what's going on. And it's only once you add up lots of these subatomic particles and lots of these atoms in the molecules, and then even with the individual molecules, certain properties like temperature and stuff arise not at the level of the individual molecules even, but in a large collection of molecules. All right, so now there's two ways we can interpret that data, right? We have these two, we have this scientific data now, and I don't disagree with that scientific data, but the question is now, how do we interpret that scientific data? There's the atomistic view, which is what's most real, or what are called quantum fields. So all those different particles I was talking about, there's a whole bunch more in what's called the standard model of particle physics. And then really what each of these are is what's called a quantum field. See if I can get maybe an image of what these might look like. I can't see any good things that seem like it described me, but essentially imagine, right? There's sort of this sort of great sheet that's three-dimensional that fills all of space. And this might be, let's say, the electron field. And so there would be what's called little excitations in these fields, little bumps in these fields that would be the electron. And there's a whole bunch of these for all the different types of particles. And then from there, those interact with one another to create sort of the appearances of these subatomic particles that then interact with one another in such a way that sort of create these appearances of atoms. Then these atoms sort of interact in such a way, creates these appearances of molecules. These molecules interact in such a way, sort of creates the appearances of larger substances. But things like that we regularly experience, like temperature and color and order, these are really just only apparent properties of fluctuations in quantum fields. This is really the bottom-up approach, sort of the atomistic approach to this model. It's gone beyond atomism in many ways in quantum field theory. But in sort of the popular conceptions, they often don't get down to quantum fields in sort of a high school science class. Remember the average high school science class, right? You're taught there's these little things called atoms, and they're made of protons, neutrons, and electrons. But they sort of compose everything, and then those build up to create these substances, and eventually you get to this highest thing. Sort of the average daily substances we encounter are not real things in the classical sense. Versus there's this other view, that sort of this top-down hierarchical view, where there is substantial form. And these form various things, and they create internal structures in the things. So I'm not saying what's called the atom now, or what's called a molecule now doesn't exist. These are real things. You can discover them very easily in a science laboratory. But I'm saying the question is, how do we interpret these? And you might say that this is only an obscure question for the philosopher of science to deal with. But if we think that our ethics, our theology, our view of nature, all of these are intertwined with one another, then no, this is actually extremely important. This is actually more important than whether or not you come out of the science classroom being able to do calculations. I've recently gotten quite interested in physics. I actually think it's a very interesting field. But I remember in high school, I hated physics class. The physics class I took in high school, which is classical mechanics, and it was, could you do the math to solve certain classical mechanics problems? And what I came out of that was basically learning nothing. I learned how to solve some systems. I'm sure if I had gone on to be an engineer or to be a physicist, that would have been very useful. But the question we have to ask is, why are we teaching science to students? And we think, all right, this is an important enough subject. It has to be included in the curriculum. And I'm not questioning that part. But what is the purpose of it? And I want to look back now at the medieval curriculums proposed sort of by St. Bonaventure and St. Thomas. I've done a video actually on St. Bonaventure's educational theory, if you want to look back at that. And I'm sure looking back at that now, there's some things I need to correct in that. The general overview, that's good. It's in his De Reductio. And what he's looking at here essentially says that in the order of what he calls natural philosophy, there's really three levels. What he calls physics, or we would now call natural science, mathematics, and metaphysics. And these are sort of increasing degrees of abstraction, that we're moving closer and closer towards what is immaterial there. And we abstract ultimately from nature, so that in theology then takes up our understandings of nature, of mathematics, and of metaphysics. In similar orders, in the order of knowing with grammar, logic, and rhetoric, and in the order of ethics, with sort of individual ethics, dealing with societies and dealing with politics as well. And if we look at St. Thomas, we actually see St. Thomas was in many ways constructing an educational curriculum with his work. And he wrote commentaries on basically all the major works of Aristotle, and he wrote introductions to most of them as well. So we see, right, he wrote a whole commentary on the physics, and he wrote a whole commentary on the metaphysics, thinking that students would use these to actually study, that you would actually work your way through the physics with his commentary and the metaphysics with his commentary, ultimately then culminating with you being able to go study the Summa, because you've now built up a strong basis. And obviously, I'm not saying here that the scientific understandings of Thomas and Bonaventure aren't in some ways outdated, but the fundamental principles underlying them are not outdated. It's those fundamental principles of how they saw the relationship of nature to everything else we study that's extremely important, because we need an understanding of nature that can be properly taken up by grace. And that's what has to be the center of our science curriculum. Our science curriculum is not trying to teach you how to do some basic mathematical calculations. It's not trying to inspire you necessarily to go over to university and get a degree in science. No, it's trying to teach the basic principles of nature, or it should be at least, trying to teach those principles of nature that are going to be important regardless of what you do. That ultimately it's our desire, right, is to know. All men by nature desire to know, as Aristotle says. And so we're trying to grasp nature so that we can then understand how nature relates to everything else, so that we can desire wisdom and goodness. And if we don't have that, if we have that wrong view of nature, we're going to be taking up our view of nature incorrectly in theology. We're going to be divorcing our ethics from natural goodness. We're ultimately going to end up with this very bifurcated view of the world. And that's really what I'm trying to get at, what has to be strongly opposed. And now I actually think the research is being done here. Let me see what books I have here on my desk right here. Yeah, one book I wanted to talk about here that I think is quite interesting in this regard is Robert Kuhn's book, Is St. Thomas's Aristotelian Philosophy of Nature Obsolete? He proposes this interesting theory of what he calls ontological escalation, that between the level of substance and the level of matter, there's a sort of ontological escalation going on of increasing degrees of reality, moving from matter up through quantum fields, then to atoms, then to molecules, then to thermodynamics, and ultimately to the real substances we encounter on a day-to-day basis. And then ultimately, really, we can then move above individual substances to see how those substances relate in ecosystems, how they relate in larger physical systems, how we relate in larger societies to one another. So I think he's heavily on the right track here, not necessarily endorsing every little detail in his approach, but I think it's generally the right approach, and lots of other people are approaching it in other ways. Wolfgang Smith has been working on this. A number of different people have worked on this in different ways. And I'm not endorsing right now, at least, I want to continue doing more research on this, any one particular answer to how we deal with all of this in modern science. I think it's an area that we need a lot of research to be being done. And ultimately, I think what we're going to end up with is not necessarily being certain of one of these particular interpretations. Just as Albert and Thomas and Bonaventure and Scotus and all these medieval scholastics were able to debate the details of these systems, but we're all agreeing on this general picture of nature. And I think that that's what's very important here, what we need to revive. I'm looking in the chat, seeing if there's anything here. Yeah, so I want to be clear, I'm not trying to put forward necessarily we should be scientific anti-realists, but I think to have a complete account of nature, we can't just have our calculations of nature that we get in mathematics. It has to be taken up within a larger philosophy of nature. And that's what's so important here. And this is, we're going back to my beginning point here. I think there's two uncreative approaches. There's sort of the anti-science view of let's not engage, let's retreat. And then there's the view of bifurcation here. And I think this is ultimately what the church is calling us to do in engaging with science. It's not calling us to uncritically parrot what Neil deGrasse Tyson thinks science teaches. No, it's calling us to have a critical engagement with contemporary science, to think seriously about these issues. And no, I'm not saying these are easy issues with easy answers. These are difficult questions that we're dealing with, but we have to be willing to put in the effort to try to actually deal with them if we want to restore a unified vision of the cosmos. All right. And see, that's everything and also, one other thing I want to mention that is sort of an argument I'm tired of hearing is I saw it just in the chat room. I'm not mentioning to hate on that person at all. I like the person who just commented in the chat, but people will say X and X theory was invented by a Catholic or a non-Catholic. And honestly, at the end of the day, it doesn't matter whether it was some priest who happened to invent a scientific theory or philosophical theory. Protestantism was invented by a Catholic priest, right? Ultimately, the question is whether it's true or not. And that's ultimately what we're interested in getting to. And so anyways, that's where I'm going to end the stream today. So thank you everyone for watching and have a blessed Sunday.